Thanks, Carrie. Hi, everybody. We're just going to give a couple of minutes to everybody to come into the meeting. So just bear with us. We'll give a few minutes. All right, Tim, you look very nice and neat and tidy. You can smile, it's okay. All right. So let's just see. People are still coming in. Oh, Uncle Glenn's there. You have to be careful what you say, Tim. And the Adeshak man. And Eve from France. Very good. And they can't answer me back, so I'm in this power seat here. Okay. There's still a few folk coming in, but I think we'll get on shortly and just let's make a start, I think. All right. So I just want to start off by welcoming everybody. I'm Roger Cressy. You'll notice I've got my background set to Yoda in the background in honor of the fact that I missed the TechCast days during the winter storm in Austin last week and couldn't host with you last week. So anyway, welcome to today's TechCast. We've got Tim German with us. He's going to be presenting, giving us his knowledge on Oracle Essbase 21c. It's termed On-Premises and Cloud Reunited. You'll see that for obvious reasons. So we'll get into more of a detailed introduction about Tim in the future in a few minutes. But on this slide, you'll see that we've got a lot of TechCasts available for you, future and past. So in upcoming, just to give you a little bit of a taster, we've got on March the 4th, we've got Philippe talking to us about making the most of OAC and Oracle Machine Learning native integration. On March the 18th, Hans Beeman and Jayant Sharma are going to be speaking on Graph Studio and Oracle Autonomous Database. Please feel free to go to the website or to YouTube. You'll find past TechCasts up there. All our TechCast days from last week, the 3 days of sessions, the winter session, you'll find those all up on there in the archives. February the 4th, we had John Mead talking us about metadata, the key to user engagement. And Irvin, before that, was talking to us about fantasy football decision support tool. So we've got a lot of good content up there for you to go and get at. Next, how do you connect with us? Well, there's lots of different ways. And so on this, we've got a Slack channel, which we'll put an invite into the chat, if that's okay, Carrie. We've got a newsletter that comes out, which you can subscribe to. We've got obviously a LinkedIn site. We've got a Twitter handle, Analytic and Data, and we've got a Facebook site. So we'd love to interact with you, and we're always looking to collaborate with people. So just so you know, in terms of logistics for this TechCast, Tim's contact details will be in the deck, and the deck and a recording of this session will be put up into the onto the archive and on YouTube. But we're always looking for good TechCast people who are ready to share their knowledge and expertise. So if you have something, please go on the site. There's an area where you can go and submit your abstract proposals for TechCasts. And we'd love to have you share your knowledge with us. So one more thing before I introduce Tim, and that is just the Q&A. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A area. Do not put them in the chat. And I will be keeping track of that. And depending on what the questions are, I may interrupt Tim as we go, or we'll keep them till the end. The session should be around 30 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A section after that. So without further ado, let me just introduce Tim. First of all, the more formal stuff. He's a director at Cubics at our company. And he's had 20 years of experience in Oracle Analytics and EPM space. He's made an Oracle ACE in 2015 and an Oracle ACE Director in 2018. He contributes in many forums. He talks often at conferences, so we're very honored to have him here today at our TechCast. And he's the current president of ODTUG. So he's an amazing guy. I've known Tim for 22 years. He's a personal friend. And apart from being one of the smartest people I know, he's absolutely passionate about Essbase. And I'm continually learning from him. So without further ado, Tim, I'll turn off my camera and my voice and hand over to you, my friend.
All right, thank you very much, Roger. And thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. I have missed very much in-person conferences over the last year and a half, and it's really nice to get a chance to talk to people, and really good to see some familiar names on the participant list here as well. So I'm going to talk about Essbase 21c, which is the very latest release. And I'll start by just talking through some of the history, and the history in part is to not just for its own sake, but explains why I think 21c is so exciting. Essbase itself has been around. It's Oracle's class-leading multi-dimensional OLAP database. Has been around for almost 30 years, which is incredible, an incredible lifespan for a technology product of this kind. And we saw the last on-premises patch release, patch being the fourth number in the numbering scheme, 11.124 in 2016. So it's been a long time since there's been a really significant on-prem upgrade to Essbase. And the 11.124 release actually goes out of Premier support at the end of this year, 2021. There is some ongoing support for Essbase 11.124 under the hood of EPM 11.2. So if you're, and it's not totally clear from a licensing perspective, unfortunately, whether people that just use Essbase are allowed to keep using a version of Essbase that's buried into EPM 11.2. It's not a technology issue, it's a licensing question for Oracle. And I think that's still being threshed out. There hasn't been a public statement to the best of my knowledge. But that does extend Premier support to 2030. But Essbase went to the cloud back in 2017, on March 17th, I think, 2017. And when that happened, it was part of the Oracle Analytics Cloud offering, OAC, which meant that it was a platform as a service offering. Oracle managed all your backups and patching and infrastructure and all those kind of things. And you've got an interface to Essbase in the cloud via the web. But a couple of years later, that changed, and Oracle Analytics Cloud is no longer being, Essbase rather, in Oracle Analytics Cloud is no longer being sold. And now you can buy Essbase 19c running on OCI. Any existing customers in the OAC version will just be allowed to run until the end of their current contracts, but after that they'll have to migrate. But 19c, it's a cloud product, but it's very different to the Essbase that's buried into, embedded rather into OAC. And that's because it's an infrastructure as a service model. So now you have access to the virtual machine that Essbase runs on. You can SSH into it and break it. You're responsible for the backups of it. You're responsible for patching, those kind of things. So it's a different proposition for customers. And that's been around since September of 2019. Now, in December, the December just gone, so a couple of months ago, Essbase 21c dropped. And 21c is really exciting for me because there's an installer for it. So it's still the same code line as 19c, which means it's the cloud code line. That means it has web interfaces and various other new features, and that the old on-prem version didn't have and never will have. But we've got an on-prem installer for it. So now you have the choice of installing the exact same Essbase on premises or in any cloud provider you choose, or your customer data center or wherever, or even on your own laptop, which is something I know a lot of consultants and people that wanted to spend time learning the product in their free time missed with the cloud product. You can have your own private environment running on your laptop. But coming very soon, you'll be able to install it on OCI. Oracle have said that should be with us within weeks, I think was the last thing I heard. Right now, the on-prem installer is only available for Linux, but it will be coming to Windows also, hopefully within the next 6 months. And so we're back to having one code line again, which I think is great because that means there'll be a lot of focus on developing new features, exciting, interesting new features in this version. And it won't matter whether you're a cloud customer or an on-prem customer, you'll have access to the new features that are being developed. Gives you a reason to want to pay your maintenance. Okay, so if you are considering going to Essbase 21c, you'll get access to all the new features that have been developed. If you're going from on-prem to 21c, all of these things that I've listed out here, I'm not going to read through them, but these are just some of the more interesting features that have appeared. All of these things will be new to you, not available on-prem. If you're coming from 19c, you'll see there's not too many features that you didn't already have. It's still a worthwhile upgrade, but it's a bigger jump if you were coming from an on-prem 11.124 or earlier version. Okay, so the new features in 21c itself, I'm just going to talk through a couple of the ones that I think are really, really significant. So Essbase has had something called hybrid mode since 2014. I'm sure if everyone participating is a Essbase developer or Essbase administrator or Essbase user, you'll be familiar with the old block storage model. And this is the dense sparse paradigm that was Essbase's first storage and calculation engine, developed way back in the 90s. And it was designed to handle the problem of data explosion that occurs when you build multidimensional models. So if you have 100 accounts in your model and 12 periods, well, you've got an array of 12,000 cells. But once you start adding 20 territories and 1,000 cost centers and 1,500 products, very quickly, the number of potential intersections gets out of control. And block storage was a really elegant solution to that problem that allowed you to address a kind of an array like that, a multi-dimensional array like that, without having to store the whole thing, which would be enormous, and also without having to pre-calculate aggregations in the whole thing. Because block storage also still provides very high query performance. And that's because a lot of the aggregated values in a block storage application are pre-calculated. A couple of other advantages for block storage are that it has a really nice procedural and dynamic calculation language. So all the functions that Essbase developers will be familiar with, the at descendants and the at sum and all of those things that look quite similar to Excel type formulas. That's all part of block storage. And taken together, these things made block storage really ideal for FP&A applications, finance applications, and the formulas themselves are like familiar looking to power users. So I think power users were able to, would be able to look at the formula and a dynamic count member and understand what it's supposed to do, and that kind of thing. It's not just an IT tool that only developers, true tech developers could handle. But then in 2000, I want to say 2005, mid 2000s anyway, somewhere, aggregate storage came along. And aggregate storage was just an alternate storage query processing kernel for Essbase. And it was designed to handle even larger dimensions than block storage could handle, and very sparse data sets very quickly. And it uses NDX as its procedural dynamic calculation language. That's a somewhat industry standard language. It's a little more unfriendly for, in my opinion, for power users. It looks more like a programming language. But it's very, very fast at aggregating on the fly. You don't have to do pre-calculation, or you can often get away without doing any pre-calculation, and you can still get extremely fast query performance on large, sparse data sets. So Hybrid, which arrived in 2014, I think, 11.123.500, is an attempt to combine the best of both of these models. So we still have BSO cubes, but we have an ASO-like query processor sat on top of them. It's implemented by making upper-level members in your Essbase cube dynamic calc in sparse dimensions, and then turning on a configuration setting. In 21c, that configuration setting is on by default. In earlier versions and on-prem, it wasn't. And the idea is that you get that reduced or zero calculation time. You don't have to pre-aggregate your cubes. You still get acceptable query performance. But you have the BSO rich, flexible calculation language that everybody understands and is able to develop in quite quickly. Back when it first arrived, not every function would be supported in Hybrid. And when a function was unsupported, Cube would go back to handle the query in the normal BSO, using the normal BSO query engine. But that function coverage has been getting better and better. It never really got there on-prem. There are still significant limitations in the on-prem version, or the 11.124 on-prem version, that limited Hybrid mode's capabilities. But in cloud, all of those, almost every single function is supported, cross-dimensional operators are supported. Pretty much any sort of calculation you can do with a very short list of exceptions is now supported. So in 21c, as I said, the coverage of Hybrid is excellent, almost every function with a small number of exceptions. But the Oracle team, the development team, have done a lot of work on improving dependency analysis, which is how, when Essbase looks at a formula, it decides which bits of input data it's going to need to grab and process to give you the result of that formula. And they've done a lot of work on that to make Hybrid mode more efficient in 21c. That means queries are faster. It also means you can get away with building larger and larger cubes. Sometimes if your cube gets too large, you're going to have to decide, well, maybe I can't make absolutely everything in this cube dynamic. Some dimensions, perhaps a dimension that's less commonly queried might have to be stored. And there are some new tools in 21c that help you figure out that trade-off. Okay. Second new feature that I think is really interesting one is shadow cubes being built into the product. So this is something that a lot of people will already have built and not known it, or not called it by this name in their own on-prem space estates. And this is where you have a set of users talking to a live cube. And then in the background, because your updates take a little bit of time and you don't want to take your live cube offline, you're updating a second cube, and then you perform some kind of operation to switch them around. And I know on-prem, sometimes people have done things like shutting down the applications and then physically copying or renaming directories and tricks like that that are probably not technically supported, renaming folders within the Essbase application structure, for example. But this has now been built into the product, and you can automate it via the REST and Java API. So Oracle have just taken that, all the boilerplate that you have to build around that for yourself is now a feature built into the product. And you don't have to worry about, is security going to survive? Is security going to follow the cube that I renamed? And all those kind of problems go away. And then I think this is the last, second to last new feature I'll talk about. The web interface in Essbase Cloud, especially outline editing, was not 100% when it first came out. It was a little slow. It didn't give access to every property. it could sometimes get confused and let you create circular references and things like that. And almost all of those problems have been resolved, and the outline editor in the web is much more performant now than it used to be. It looks a lot nicer as well. And then there are some new features rather in Cube Designer. So Cube Designer is an extension to Smart View specifically for building offline or working with cubes offline or working with them in Excel and then pushing them to an Essbase cloud instance. Only works with cloud, not on-prem. And the development team have added some new optimization utilities to Cube Designer. There is a data distribution utility that helps you decide which of your dimensions should be sparse, which should be dense. It's very handy. Does basically performs a process of making individual dimensions dense one at a time, and then reports on the results of that. It's an exercise you could always do in the past, but it's just automated for you by Cube Designer. There is a utility for reviewing and identifying potential performance problems caused by solve order settings. There is a tool for calculating an appropriate size of calculator cache. And then there is the baseline utility, and that's what you can see in the background on this screenshot. It's the baseline utility output. And what that does is it goes away and performs a data load, builds a cube, performs a calculation optionally, and performs some queries that you've set up optionally. And it tells you what the performance of all those things, was, like how much data your calculation generated, how long it took, how large your page and index files are, how long your queries took. And the reason this is interesting is that you can tweak your cube, especially if you've got a hybrid cube. You can decide, okay, I'm going to make my product dimension dynamic, but I'm going to leave my market dimension stored. You can go and run the baseline utility and see how all those different performance parameters change. And you can kind of find the sweet spot, the trade-off between query performance and calculation duration and data load duration, for example. It's a really nice feature. I'm enjoying playing with this since I've had it installed on my laptop. And then finally, some of the most, for people that have been using these tools for a long time and have used them on-prem, some of the most interesting new features are really old features that have come back again. This is only applicable for non-OCI marketplace deployments, i.e., I think deploying on-prem. But you now have, so Essbase Cloud has had, if I can jump to this without breaking anything, Essbase Cloud has had this user interface. This is the modern web user interface, sometimes called the Jet UI. And it's very, very different to EAS, to Essbase Administration Services. And I think that what Oracle have realized is that creates a little bit of friction when people want to migrate. So we now have a version of EAS called EAS Lite that comes with Essbase 21c. So you still have this interface. You can still use this new modern UI, but you can also choose, at least as a stopgap measure, to use the old EAS. And I think I have this. I think I have it running now. My laptop, yeah, looks exactly like, more or less exactly like EAS has always looked. What this doesn't let you do is access any of the new features that would involve EAS. So, for example, there's improved drill through, and that can be developed independently of Studio, for example. And that kind of feature is never going to be exposed in EAS. But if you're migrating, so you haven't used any of the new cloud-only features, then this will work. This creates a low friction way of moving to learn all the new admin interfaces immediately. We also have shared services security. To use this, you'd be required to set up an independent shared services instance. You can't share the shared services instance of an EPM environment, for example. But again, it means that your security management, if you're migrating from on-prem, where you've been using shared services for years, you can continue to use shared services. and just again lowers the friction of moving. A bit of time. Okay, 5 minutes. Okay, so rattle through some of this. So pricing and hosting. So if you go to OCI, you go to Oracle Cloud, there's a consumption-based option. That means you pay a certain hourly rate for each CPU in your environment. You can shut down and start up, change the size of your instances whenever you want. And the exact price of that varies depending on the contract model you have. So whether you have a monthly commitment or monthly flex, or you literally pay as you go. From memory, I think monthly flex is about $60 per OCPU hour, and pay as you go is maybe $2.40, somewhere around that per OCPU hour. You do have to add storage, networking, compute, and database repository fees to that. Normally, for a normally sized environment, those fees are all a lot smaller than the hourly rate charges for running Essbase. And there's a link here to a blog post I wrote a while back that was for 19c, but I think will be equally relevant to 21c, that just goes through those in a bit more detail and works an example of figuring out what options are most effective. And then if you have on-premises licenses, you have some different options. Even if you go to cloud or you stay on-prem, if you're staying on-prem, CPU licensing or user-based licensing just stay like for like. So if you're going to cloud, every CPU license that you have on-prem will convert to 2 OCPUs on OCI. User-based licensing can also be taken like for like to OCI. And that's a really great, very cost-efficient way of getting started. If you have 100 user licenses, you can decide to split those user licenses between the cloud and your on-prem system. So if you can spare a few user licenses from your on-prem system, you can take these to cloud and get started and really spin up an environment that is as powerful as you like in terms of CPUs very inexpensively. That's a really good way to get started. It's also a great way to spin up an environment if you wanted to do something like benchmarking, figure out how many CPUs you needed. It's a cheap way to do that. And again, if you're going to cloud, you have to factor in the storage, networking, compute power, and repository costs. But again, those are typically a small proportion of the CPU costs. Okay. So how do you actually get there? Well, there's a few different deployment options. If you're going to the OCI, Oracle Cloud Infrastructure Marketplace, and you're using an autonomous transaction processing repository, there is a wizard, a Terraform that basically populates and runs a Terraform script in the background, and it spins everything up for you. It creates the storage, it creates the virtual cloud network, all those kind of pieces. You still own them all. You still have to know they're there. You still have to think about how they're being backed up and things like that. But it does make it very easy to get spun up. The Terraform scripts that are used to do that are also made available by Oracle on GitHub. And you could just take the Terraform scripts and customize them. So if you want to do some specific network configuration on your environment, or possibly, I have never done this, but possibly if you wanted to take those Terraform scripts and modify them to work with a different hosting provider, AWS or any other hosting provider, you might be able to use them as a starting point. And if you're going to on-prem or you're installing yourself on a different cloud host, there is an installer that you can download. You need to have a database, you need to have Linux 7 or 8 at the moment, no Windows support yet, and Red Hat Enterprise Linux or Oracle Enterprise Linux 7 or 8. And you have to download and install Fusion middleware and download and install Essbase. I made a note here that it's e-delivery only. Getting access to e-delivery and getting access to the software is not a problem. The unfortunate thing at the moment with it being e-delivery only is that, like I have this copy running on my laptop that I installed very recently, but the e-delivery license terms are 30-day trial use. And back in the day, you used to be able to download Essbase from OTN, or Technology Network. And the OTN license terms are different, and they let you use the software indefinitely for educational non-production purposes. The e-delivery license is just a lot more restrictive, and I really, really hope that Essbase 21c is going to pop up on OTN sooner or later, because for people like me who want their own copy to kick the tires and play with and learn, develop training materials and things like that, it's very helpful to have an unlimited, unrestricted, not unlimited license. And then I'll talk very quickly, because we are running out of time, about some migration tasks. So generally speaking, security should be migrated first. If you're going to on-premises, you have a few options. You can use shared services that we talked about before, or you can use the WebLogic LDAP security that's built in to Fusion middleware. And in either case, you can configure an external authentication provider like Active Directory to work with it. And if you're going to cloud, your target is IDCS, Identity Management Cloud Service. And you can do this move. If you're moving from shared services to shared services, you can use LCM. If you're going from shared services to the WebLogic security, you can use LCM, but you have to make some manual edits to the output, which are described in the Oracle migration documentation. Sorry, I should expand. LCM, lifecycle management. It's just a tool for moving artifacts in Essbase or EPM from one environment to another. And then there's also a migration utility built into 21c that you can download from the web interface that helps you move security for OAC or 19c versions of Essbase to 21c. Moving the applications, again, depends where you're moving from and to. If you're going from on-premises, then you can use lifecycle management. There is a special version of lifecycle management that you download from 21c, download from the web interface, and you can export with that and then import to your cloud or on-premises 21c instance using the user interface or using the Essbase command line interface, the CLI. That's one option. You can also use the Cube Designer format and use a tool called the DBX export utility. The downside with that is that it doesn't bring across all artifacts. So it will create your metadata and your data and your calc scripts, but it won't, if you have lots of custom load rules or database connections and things like that, it won't bring them across. If you're going from cloud to cloud, so from an existing cloud version of 21c, there is a migration utility that's provided, and that moves everything, moves your entire environment. So if you use that utility, it probably makes sense to clean up a bit first on your source system. You can also use the command line interface, which generates an LCM export from an existing cloud version and move one application at a time. Again, you can import that export using the command line interface or the web UI. And then finally, this is a very brief summary of a very complicated topic, but migrating existing automation. So Maxell continues to work in 21c. There is a new Maxell client that's required. Can be downloaded from the 21c instance itself. Again, it's a kind of common theme, like a lot of the utilities now and the end user tools are all available as downloads within the web interface of the product itself, rather than having to go get them separately from Oracle, which is very handy. So Maxell continues to work. The Java API continues to work, just requires, both of those tools require some updates to Essbase connection strings. If you're making relational connections, those will likely need to be configured in 21c. If you're moving files around as part of your automation, so pushing a file to or from the server, if you're going from an on-prem system, you're going to have to figure out how to rework that. But the ability to push files to and delete files from the Essbase server is automatable using the Essbase command line interface. If you're going from cloud to cloud, there should be minimal changes because pretty much all of the above already applied in 19c and OAC. And then one other note on automation, and that's the REST API that's only available in the cloud versions of Essbase is a really great API. It's really full coverage. And that means you can do things with the REST API that you could ever do with any automation interface before. Like change a load rule, for example. Not something you could ever, believe, automate with any existing API. And it's pretty much anything you can do, or I should qualify that, anything you can do in the user interface of Essbase 21c can be done via the REST API. And I believe, because I've been told this by people at Oracle, the reason that is the case is that the web user interface, the modern web UI itself, uses the same API underneath. So that was a lot of content in not a lot of time. But the real high points for 21c for me is first, that we're back to having one future-proof code line again, where whether you're in the cloud or you're on premises, you're using the same version, you're getting access to the same new features, all the development that your maintenance dollars are paying for if you're a customer, and you're getting access to that development again. There are some genuinely compelling features that are cloud only, especially the Gen 2 hybrid mode. I think I saw, watched a presentation by Karen Zubitz from Oracle a few weeks ago. Her take was that hybrid mode is really ready for prime time. If you can't make your application work in hybrid mode, they more or less consider that a bug and they want to hear from you. So it really is the default going forward, and it has some really great possibility, to build highly analytic applications with complex logic and so on, but without the pain of having to wait for your account to run every time you change data. It's really, especially for planning type use cases where you get a lot of data submitted quickly in small chunks by users, that's really powerful. Oracle have provided lots of tools and utilities to ease migration and make it easy to move from on-prem or other cloud environments to 21c. And then finally, they've also provided tools to give you a familiar user and admin experience on migrating, so to really minimize the friction of moving to 21c. And of course, Smart View and all those tools, end user tools, continue to work. Everything looks the same as it did for end users, besides the new. So with that, are there any questions?
Okay, so I got, first of all, a comment from Glenn Schwartzberg saying, I believe REST will be available for on-prem as well, since it is going through the web UI.
Oh.
So.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. REST will work against an on-prem instance of 21c. So yeah, any automation you develop with REST API. Yeah, I'm sorry if I didn't say that.
And then this, that's great. And then this from Mr. Anonymous Attendee says, customers using Essbase and planning on-prem 11.124, what would be the option if they want to upgrade to 21c on-prem? I think you did answer this, but if you want to just quickly comment on that.
Yeah, let me make sure I get it right. So the question was using Essbase and planning.
Yes.
Yeah, so right now, part of this is technical, part of the answer to this is technical, and part of it is licensing. But right now, 11.2, the latest EPM release, only uses what is really 11.124 Essbase under the hood. And Essbase 21c is not yet certified for use as the engine under the EPM stack, so primarily planning. So if you want to use 21c, you're going to have to run a separate instance, probably on a separate physical server, and run 21c. And continue to run 11.124 as the engine under planning. Now my understanding is that the EPM team are looking at eventually certifying Essbase 21c as the engine under EPM on-prem. And you would think it makes sense, right, not to have to support two versions. EPM 11.2 is supported through on-prem through 2030, and it certainly makes sense for me for the Essbase team not to have to support multiple code lines for that whole 9-year, 10-year period. But right now, that's the answer. You would have to have two Essbase servers.
Okay. Then Hector Andrade says, shadow cubes is like cube transparent partitions, question mark. we usually use them to update the only 2 months of history to a month-end queue, to a front-end queue. So I don't, if you want to just comment on that, because I don't believe that.
Yeah, so it's not, I don't think it's quite the same. So if I understand the use case that the person asking the question is talking about, that's where you might have a smaller cube that is kind of your live data that's being changed. And then you transparent partition that to all of your history that goes back with way more data. That's a good technique. It's a clever technique for improving the efficiency of data updates. Shadow cubes, you only access one cube at once. What happens is you perform your update operations, so your restructures and your data loads and your calcs on the shadow cube that users are not touching, but you don't have to take down the cube that they're touching while it happens. It's almost, they are effectively two separate cubes. And then when you get done with your updates, they kind of switch out, but it happens transparently to the user. So it's not that it reduces your calculation time or your load time the way the transparent partition technique does. And what it does is reduces the downtime experienced by end reporting users.
Okay. Then Eve Pebble. Hi Eve, nice to see you on. While upgrading from 11.124, should we convert apps to Unicode with 11.124 first, or can it be handled by LCM during the migration process?
That's a great question, Eve.
I know we used to have.
You don't have to. There is an option. I'm sorry, I can't answer that directly. I will send you an email. There's an option where you don't have to do that. You could do it, but you don't have to. I'm sure I read an option on that in the migration documentation. Sorry, I can't answer that straight up.
Thanks, Ben. Then very quickly, I know we've got a few minutes still. BSO, ASO, hybrid. Can you give us a very simple indication of use cases best suited to each type?
Yeah, so BSO, great for applications that require lots of logic, not just aggregation, typically financial, but not only, and typically a little smaller in terms of dimensionality. Like there is actually a limit to the size of BSO dimensionality documented. ASO support is generally better for rack and stack type applications where you're aggregating, but aggregating very large dimensions, very large data sets. So tends to be more operational. Things like sales of items at stores by hour or something like that, not finances by month, not accounts by month, those kind of applications. I'm sure you can find counter examples of both types done in both kernels. And then hybrid is trying to bridge that gap. So let you have all the calculation flexibility and complex analytics of BSO, but scale in the way that ASO does, and give you the instant aggregation that ASO does. So no waiting for your ag count to run for an hour every time you change the data.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. One from Mr. Anonymous again. ODI loads to Essbase. It's supported for FTMEE ODI that 11.2 uses, or do we need to run a separate ODI instance? Yeah, we'll have to get back to you on that. I think.
Yeah.
If
there's a contact, or you can post a contact. I'll find out. And if you want to ask that question, can post an email address. I don't know offhand.
Yeah. And then one more question, I think, before, because we're almost at the 45 minutes stage. Why is it called EAS Lite? Which features are missing compared to the current on-premises version?
That's a really good question. I do not know the answer to it. I've been thinking about this myself. It doesn't support any new feature that is cloud only. But in kicking the tires with it, I've not found an example of something that it doesn't do that EAS normally does. And I have not found a documented list either. That is a great question. Again, if the person that asked that can have provided an email address, I'll put the question to the dev team and try and understand, because there must be something.
Yeah, I see Ashish on there on the call, so he can be prepped to receive some of these questions. But I think with that, I think we're at time. So it just remains, Tim, thank you very much. That was a really good presentation, and very grateful that you could come and join us. Nice to see Odie Tug working with AMD OUC. So yeah. Welcome. Thanks very much for your efforts.
Thank you. Thanks everybody.
Yeah. So this presentation and the recording of it will be posted to our archives